Like the books found at Nag Hammadi, the Gospel according to Mary Magdalene is also considered an apocryphal text. The story it contains begins sometime after the resurrection. The disciples have just had a vision of Jesus.
Jesus encouraged the disciples to go out and preach his teachings to the world, but they're afraid to do so because he was killed for it, and they say if they killed him, they're going to kill us too. And it's Mary, and that's Mary Magdalene, that's quite clear, who steps forward and says, don't be worried, he promised he would be with us, he'll protect us.
She's the one who can step in and remain calm and not be frightened. And it says she turns their hearts toward the good. And they begin to discuss the words of the Savior.
In books like the Gospel of Philip, Mary was presented as a symbol of wisdom. But in the Gospel of Mary, she is the one in charge, telling the disciples about Jesus' teachings. Previously, we were merely told that she was wise. In this Gospel, we can see it for ourselves.
Now, at this point, Peter asks Mary to tell them some things that she might have heard, but which the other disciples haven't. And she says, I will tell you what has been hidden from you. And so she talks about a vision she had of Jesus and a conversation that she had with him.
As the Gospel tells it, Mary then relates the details of this conversation, which is to do with spiritual development and the soul's lifelong battle with evil.
But at this point, controversy arises. And Andrew steps in and he says, well, I don't know what the rest of you think, but these things seem very strange to me, and it seems that she's telling us teachings that are different from the Savior.
This is clearly a point of contention. At least one disciple, and perhaps more, doubt the truth of what Mary says. And there is worse to come.
Peter then chimes in, and he says, are we supposed to now all turn around and listen to her? Would Jesus have spoken privately with a woman rather than openly to us? Did he prefer her to us?
Matthew defends Mary and quells Peter's attack on her. In the text, Peter's problem is that Jesus selected Mary above the other disciples to interpret his teachings. Peter sees Mary as a rival for the leadership of the group itself.
She's portrayed as the disciple who really gets it, if you will, who really understands what's going on and understands his teaching.
The text makes it clear that what qualifies her to lead the group is her spiritual maturity.
The irony is that most people think of Peter as the rock upon which the church was established. He is, the main or major disciple figure, and Mary Magdalene is, at best, a kind of side figure in the cast of characters.
The Gospel of Mary is such a challenge to our view of Mary Magdalene that we have to be sure it's authentic. After all, no one really knows where it came from. And unlike other early Christian writings, there was no reference to it before it was found.
What's fascinating about the discovery of the Gospel of Mary is we didn't even know it existed. We didn't even have the title itself.
So how do we know that it is an authentic ancient document and not a forgery? It would help to know its age. Coptic text is difficult to date accurately. But amazingly, 2 other fragments of the Gospel were found in a rubbish heap, and these were written in Greek, which made dating much easier.
The Greek fragments can be dated on the basis of their handwriting. That suggests that the Gospel of Mary was probably composed already in the early part of the 3rd century, or perhaps already in the 2nd century.
And, as a leading Coptic expert, Stephen Emmel believes it must be authentic.
For someone to have purposely fabricated these manuscripts in modern times would require a kind of genius that I think just doesn't exist. This is someone who would have to be able to manufacture papyrus using techniques that have been lost for more than 1,000 years. They'd have to have had a knowledge of Coptic that goes far beyond anything that the greatest specialists in Coptic have ever had. They would have had to have conceived of an entire world that no one else knows anything about in every detail. It's not credible that someone could create such a fabrication.
If the Gospel of Mary is genuine, it might provide the real reason that Mary Magdalene vanished from the Bible. Controversially, it offers a very different view of the disciples.
One of the absolutely fascinating things about the Gospel of Mary is it really asks us to rethink that story about Christian history. Did all the disciples get it? Did they really understand and preach the truth? Now, this is very radical and perhaps, I think heretical.
And perhaps the Gospel of Mary was just too radical. It presents Mary as a teacher and spiritual guide to the other disciples. She's not just a disciple, she's the apostle to the apostles. And yet, we only know Mary Magdalene as a prostitute. So how was her reputation so drastically distorted? The authorship of the Gospel of Mary holds a clue. Mary didn't write the Gospel herself. She had been dead for a long time. But experts now have an idea who did.
I would guess that it was a woman. I think one has to assume that it was written by someone who belonged to a Christian community in which women had a prominent role, but where that role was being disputed.
The Gospel of Mary grew out of the way that the first Christians came together, and the makeup of these groups was shaped by where they met.
The early churches met in houses, and attracted people who were friends and so forth. Eating together was one of the primary practices of these communities.
And as houses were the domain of women, they naturally played a prominent part within these communities.
Women played all kinds of roles as apostles, teachers, heads of house churches, so on and so forth. We see, for example, from Paul's letter to Corinth, that there were women prophets within the Christian community.
But in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, differences were already emerging between groups led by men and groups led by women.
Within some groups of early Christianity, Mary Magdalene became a key figure, a kind of prototypical figure, especially representing the female Christian.
She takes on the role of representing women in general versus men in general. And the disciples, who are the men, sometimes try to reject her from their company, and she stands up for herself and, by implication, women. But the representative of the men who says no to her generally is Peter.
Mary's relationship with Peter came to symbolize this conflict.
There's this sort of wealth of early Christian writings in which the tension between Peter and Mary is quite apparent. And you see this not only in the Gospels that are now in the New Testament, but you see it in a whole range of early Christian sources which do not find their way into the New Testament.
As Peter and the ideas he stood for became dominant in the growing movement, so Mary's role as an important disciple was undermined. And as the church became more institutionalized, women leaders were squeezed out.
What happens to that Mary? Well, she must be the victim of the power struggle, must be a victim of the way history gets written. And who writes history? Men write history.
By the time we get into the 4th and 5th century, simply for women to exercise public leadership is itself heretical. So women cannot be ordained, for example, to become a bishop or a priest and so forth. And from that perspective, Mary Magdalene becomes a real problem because she can be used to validate women's leadership in the church.
This was an image of Mary that wasn't popular